The morning Gilbert Yates rode back into Harding Creek, the sky was the color of a bruise healing wrong, and there was not a single soul standing at the edge of town to welcome him home. That suited him fine. He had not come back to be welcomed. He had come back because there was nowhere else left to go, and because the small parcel of land his father had left him was the only thing on this earth that belonged to him outright, without blood debt or memory attached. Or so he had told himself the whole long ride from Missouri, through the flat dust of Kansas, down into the scrub-brush flats of the Texas Panhandle, where Harding Creek sat like a forgotten coin in the crease of a man's pocket. The year was 1873, and Gilbert Yates was 31 years old, and he felt every single day of it in the bones of his back. He rode a roan gelding he had bought off a livery man in Dodge City for less than the horse was worth, which told him something about how badly the livery man had needed the money. The horse's name, according to a scrap of paper tucked under the saddle blanket, had been Preacher. Gilbert had not laughed at that. He had just folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket and ridden on. Harding Creek had grown some in the 8 years he had been gone. There was a proper general store now, its sign freshly painted in red letters. There was a hotel of sorts, really just a boarding house with a second floor added on by someone who had more ambition than skill, because the whole structure leaned slightly to the east. There was a church, whitewashed and plain, with a bell tower that held no bell, and there was a sheriff's office which was new and a saloon which was not. The saloon he recognized. He had been thrown out of it once at the age of 17 for trying to buy whiskey with a promissory note. He had no particular feeling about the place now. He tied Preacher at the post outside the general store and went in to buy flour and salt and a pound of dried beans, because those were the things a man needed when he was about to live alone on a stretch of flat land with no neighbors closer than 3 miles. The woman behind the counter was Mrs. Alderman, and she looked at him with wide eyes and said, "Gilbert Yates, Lord above, I didn't think you'd come back." "Here I am," he said, and paid for his supplies and loaded them into his saddlebag and did not linger. His father's land was 6 miles east of town, sitting at the junction of 2 dry creek beds that filled up maybe 3 months out of 12, and left the rest of the year just looking like pale scars in the earth. The house was still standing, which surprised him. It was a low adobe structure with 2 rooms and a roof that had seen better decades, but the walls were thick, and the door was solid, and there was a well out back that still produced water when he worked the handle. He unsaddled Preacher and put him in the small corral that had weathered the years well enough, and then he stood in the doorway of the house and looked at what the years had left him. Dust, mouse droppings, a table missing one leg that someone had propped up on a stack of old newspapers, a rusted stove that would need work before it would be safe to use, his father's chair, still sitting by the window, with the shape of the old man worn into its seat. Gilbert sat down on the floor with his back against the wall and did not move for a long time. He had come home from the war in 1865, the same as 10,000 other men, carrying nothing but a rifle he no longer wanted to fire, and a silence that had grown so thick inside him he sometimes felt it pressing against the backs of his eyes. He had tried to make a go of it in Missouri. He had tried farming, and then he had tried working for a cattle outfit up in Nebraska, and then he had tried doing nothing much at all for a year in a town in Colorado that had the word silver in its name and very little actual silver left in the ground. None of it had taken hold. The problem, if he was honest with himself, and he had decided somewhere in the middle of Kansas that he might as well be honest, since there was no one else around to hear it, was not that he could not work. He could work. He had worked all his life. The problem was that he had come back from the war without whatever it was that made work feel like it was building towards something. He dug wells and planted fields and drove cattle, and at the end of every day, the thing he had built felt as hollow as a gourd rattling with dry seeds. He ate and slept and rose and did it again, and somewhere in the middle of all that the years had passed. Now he was home. Now he would try once more, because the land his father had left him was real, and it was paid for, and the dry creek beds had names Little Heron and Cutwater, and maybe that was enough to start with. He spent the first week alone. He fixed the stove, replaced the table leg, swept out the house, patched the roof where 3 adobe bricks had crumbled into the gap, and repaired the corral fence with posts he cut from the scrub cedar that grew in a ragged line along the eastern property edge. He planted nothing yet. It was late October, and the ground was hard, but he turned the earth in the small garden plot beside the house and let it breathe. He fed Preacher and talked to the horse in the evenings, not because he believed the horse understood him, but because the sound of his own voice in that empty landscape was the closest thing he had to company. He did not go to church. He had not gone to church since before the war, since the Sunday before he enlisted, when he had sat in a pew in the white clapboard church in his hometown in Tennessee, and listened to the preacher say that God was on their side, and had thought, with the clear, cool certainty of an 18-year-old who had never yet seen a man die, that of course he was. He had not thought that since. He had not prayed since either. Not once. Not in 4 years of war, not in 8 years of wandering afterward. There were men who had come back praying harder than ever, and he respected that, or tried to. It was just not in him anymore. Whatever conversation he'd once had with God had ended somewhere in Virginia in the summer of 1862, in a field of dead men, and he had not found his way back to it. It was the second week of November when he first saw Ruth Winslow. He had ridden into town for more supplies, salt pork this time, and nails, and a new drawknife he needed for some fence work, and he was loading the saddlebag at the hitching post when the stagecoach came in from the east. The stage from Amarillo ran through Harding Creek twice a week, carrying mail and the occasional passenger, and usually Gilbert paid it no mind. But this time he looked up because the driver was shouting something about a wheel, and in the commotion of horses and raised voices and dust, one of the passengers climbed down from the coach unassisted while the driver was still arguing with the wheel. She was perhaps 26 or 27, slender, with dark hair coiled neatly under a brown traveling hat. She wore a gray wool dress that had been mended at the hem, and carried a single trunk that she had somehow managed to lower from the top of the coach herself, because the driver was occupied. She stood in the street with the trunk at her feet and looked at Harding Creek with an expression that was not quite disappointment and not quite determination, but something that lived in the narrow space between them. And Gilbert had the peculiar sensation of watching someone take a breath before a very long swim. He should have ridden on. He had nails and salt pork and a long afternoon of work ahead of him. Instead, he stood holding Preacher's reins and watched her look at the town, and then he watched her pick up one end of her trunk and begin dragging it toward the boarding house, which was 50 yards away, which was going to take her a considerable while at this rate. He crossed the street before he had decided to. "Let me take the other end," he said. She looked at him with gray eyes that were direct without being challenging. "That is kind of you," she said. "I would appreciate it." They carried the trunk to the boarding house without saying much else. He was aware, in a way he had not been aware of much lately, of her hands gripping the rope handle of the trunk, the redness the rope had already left on her palm, the fact that she did not complain about it or mention it at all. At the door of the boarding house she said, "Thank you, Mr. Yates," he said. "Gilbert Yates." "Ruth Winslow," she said, and put out her hand, and he shook it, which surprised him. Not many women offered their hand that way, but she did it naturally, like it was the obvious thing. "I appreciate your help." "You are welcome," he said. And then, because he felt the conversation ending in a way he was not entirely ready for, he said, "Are you here to stay?" She looked at the street behind him, at the dust still settling from the stage, at the leaning boarding house and the church with no bell. "I believe so," she said. "I have accepted a position teaching school." There was no school in Harding Creek. He almost said so, but she seemed to know that already from the tilt of her chin, the way she was already calculating what would need to be built. "I wish you good luck then, Miss Winslow," he said. "Mrs. Winslow," she said, gently but clearly. He stepped back. "Excuse me, Mrs. Winslow. No need to apologize," she said. "My husband passed 2 years ago. I don't always correct people." He nodded because there was nothing right to say to that. He touched the brim of his hat and led Preacher away, and he did not look back. But he was aware, all the way down the street and past the turn onto the East Road, of the weight of that conversation, not heavy, exactly. More like the way a stone feels in the bottom of a quiet pond. He thought about her on the ride home, not in any particular way, just the way you think about something that was different from the ordinary run of your day. Over the following weeks, Harding Creek arranged itself around Ruth Winslow in the way that small towns do when something new arrives that they don't quite know what to make of but can't quite disapprove of either. She was a widow. She was respectable. She was educated. The town needed a schoolteacher, badly enough that 3 families had already donated lumber for a schoolhouse that existed only on paper. She attended church her first Sunday, which went a long way toward being accepted, and she was seen helping old Mrs. Carraway carry a basket of laundry, and she was seen firmly but politely declining the attentions of 2 cowboys from the Delaney outfit who had gotten it into their heads that a young widow was fair game for clumsy flirting outside the general store. Gilbert heard all this secondhand from Tom Alderman at the general store, who talked while he weighed salt pork and seemed to view the provision of information as part of the service. Gilbert listened and said little and went home and went back to work. He saw her again in December, on a cold gray morning when the sky was the color of pewter and the wind was cutting in from the north. He had ridden in for mail. There was a letter from his sister in Tennessee, the first in years, and he nearly walked into Ruth Winslow coming out of the post office as he was going in. They both stopped. She was carrying a packet of papers tied with string, and the wind was making a serious effort to take them. "Good morning, Mr. Yates," she said, one hand pressing the papers against her coat. "Mrs. Winslow," he said, "cold morning." "I had noticed," she said, and there was a small dry humor in it that caught him off guard enough that he almost smiled. He held the door for her as she came out. The wind took a single sheet from the top of her packet and sent it skipping along the porch boards, and they both went after it, and he caught it against the heel of his boot. He handed it back. It was a lesson plan, covered in neat handwriting spelling words and arithmetic problems, and a passage from a reader he did not recognize. "For the school," he said. "The school opens in January," she said. "Or it will if the lumber arrives before the ground freezes entirely. I have some cedar posts I could spare," he said, "and time if it would help." She looked at him with those direct gray eyes for a moment, as if she were deciding whether the offer was genuine. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. "That would be a great help to the community," she said. "Thank you." He helped build the schoolhouse. It took most of December, with a shifting crew of men from town farmers and ranch hands and old Mr. Plimmer, who was 73 and insisted on holding boards while younger men nailed them, because he said he had built enough in his life to know that someone had to hold the boards. Gilbert was there almost every day, not because he had volunteered to be the primary builder, but because he had good skills with a drawknife and a square, and because, if he was telling himself the whole truth, the work felt different when it was building something that would be used by children to learn to read. Ruth came by the construction site every afternoon. She brought coffee in a tin pot and distributed it without fuss, and she would stand at the edge of the growing structure and look at the framing going up and make notes in a small book she carried. Sometimes she talked to the men about the school, what she needed, what the children would study, how she had taught before back in Ohio. Sometimes she talked to Gilbert specifically, because he was usually the one working nearest to her, and because their conversations had developed a quality of ease that he had not noticed accumulating until it was already there. He found out in pieces the shape of her life. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a minister. She had married a man named Calvin Winslow at the age of 22, a schoolteacher himself, a good man, quiet and steady, and they had moved to Kansas together with the intention of opening a school there. Calvin had died of a fever in the spring of 1871, 2 years into their marriage, leaving Ruth widowed at 24 with very little money and a deep unwillingness to go back to Ohio and let herself be absorbed back into her father's household. She had taught in a small school in Kansas for a year, then heard about the position in Harding Creek through a church network that seemed to span the whole of the frontier, and had come. She told these things simply, without self-pity or drama, the way a person tells facts about a road they have traveled, noting the hills without dwelling on how hard they were to climb. Gilbert respected this enormously. He had met too many people on the frontier who either refused to speak of hard things at all or else could not stop speaking of them, and Ruth Winslow occupied the rare and comfortable middle ground of a person who had made a kind of peace with what had happened to her without pretending it had not happened. He did not tell her much about himself. Not yet. She did not push for it. But she listened, on those cold December afternoons with coffee steam rising between them, when he said small things about the land, about his horse, about his father, who had built the adobe house and broken the soil of those 6 miles of flat Texas earth, and died in 1868, while Gilbert was still in Nebraska, not knowing that his son was close enough to have come. The guilt of that was a familiar weight, and he had learned to carry it without letting it show, but something about the way Ruth listened made him less careful about hiding it, and once or twice he said more than he intended to and then fell silent, waiting for the discomfort. The discomfort never came. She just listened and nodded, and sometimes said something small and true, and then the conversation moved on. The schoolhouse was finished on the 23rd of December. They hung the door and put the last coat of whitewash on the exterior and stood back and looked at it in the flat winter light. It was a plain building, low-ceilinged, with 4 windows and 2 rows of benches and a raised platform at the front for the teacher's desk that Gilbert had built from the cedar posts. But it was solid and square, and the door hung true, and Ruth Winslow walked through it and turned around in the middle of the room and looked at the light coming through the windows and said quietly, "This is exactly right." Gilbert felt something shift in his chest, very slightly, like a door settling on new hinges. On Christmas Day, the town gathered at the church. Gilbert did not go to the service. He stayed on his land and fixed a section of fence that did not need fixing and fed preacher extra oats, and told himself he preferred the quiet. In the afternoon, he rode into town to get a letter he had left at the post office, and found the street empty and still, and the sound of singing coming from the church. And he stopped preacher in the street, and listened for a moment to the sound of a congregation singing something he recognized from before the war, from the church of his childhood, and the familiarity of it was so acute that it felt almost like a physical thing pressing against his ribs. He rode on. January opened cold, and the school opened with it. 11 children arrived on the first morning, ranging in age from 6 to 14, and Ruth Winslow received them with the calm authority of someone who had been doing this their whole life. Gilbert knew this because Tom Alderman told him, and because he had ridden past the school that morning and seen the children arriving, and had not ridden fast enough past the window to avoid seeing Ruth standing at the front of the room writing letters on a chalkboard she had somehow acquired from somewhere, her back straight, her handwriting large and clear. He had a reason to be near the schoolhouse in January, because the well he had dug for it in December had developed a small problem with the casing that needed correcting before the ground froze completely, and he had told himself he would fix it in January, and he did. It took 2 afternoons, and both afternoons Ruth came out during her midday break and offered him coffee, and they talked, and he began to notice the specific quality of the silence between their words, which was not empty but full. The way good soil is full, dense with things that were not yet growing, but that had everything they needed. On the second afternoon she said, You helped build this school and you fixed the well and you have not asked me for anything in return. Most men would have. He was crouched over the well casing, not looking at her. It needed doing, he said. A lot of things need doing, she said. Not everyone does them. He looked up then. She was standing in her coat with her hands wrapped around a tin cup, and the winter light was at a low angle that made the shadows long and sharp, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not read entirely but that contained, he thought, something like genuine curiosity. Not the social kind. The real kind, the kind that is interested in what it will find. He stood up and brushed dirt from his knees. I grew up on land like this, he said. My father built everything himself. I guess I learned that things that need doing get done. Your father sounds like he was a good man, she said. He was, Gilbert said, and then before he could decide against it, he was a man of faith too. Church every Sunday, grace at every meal. He never went a day without it, I don't think. I used to think that was just habit. Now I think it was the thing that held him together. Ruth was quiet for a moment. And you, she said, with a directness that was not intrusive but simply honest. Has it not held you? He did not answer right away. He picked up his tools and set them in the bag and took his time about it. I lost it, he said finally, in the war, or maybe the war took it. I have not been able to find my way back to it. She did not say that was a shame, or that he should try harder, or any of the things a preacher's daughter might have said. She just nodded, as if he had told her something she was filing carefully away. Sometimes, she said, the way back is through a door you did not expect. He did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, and she went back inside, and he rode home in the January dusk thinking about what she had said for the entire 6 miles. February brought a cold snap that froze the top inch of the creek beds and kept everyone indoors more than usual. Gilbert worked on the interior of the house, building shelves and repairing the chimney and laying a new floor in the second room, because he found himself thinking about the second room differently than he had when he arrived. He was not entirely sure what that meant. He was fairly sure, but he was a careful man with words, even the ones he only said to himself. He had taken to riding into town on Saturday afternoons, which he told himself was for supplies, and it was partly, but it was also because Saturdays were when Ruth finished her week of teaching and could sometimes be found at the general store or at the boarding house porch in the late afternoon, and they had fallen into a loose habit of talking. Nothing was arranged. It just happened. He would arrive and she would be there, or she would arrive and he would be there, and the conversation would resume from wherever it had left off, which was both simple and remarkable. He had told her, by mid-February, more about himself than he had told anyone in years. He had told her about the war, not the specific violence of it. He did not tell those stories to anyone, and he suspected he never would. But the way it had changed the shape of the world for him, the way he had come back to a country that looked the same and felt entirely different, as if someone had replaced all the familiar things with copies that were not quite right. He had told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12, and about his sister Margaret, who was married and living in Tennessee, and who wrote letters that were warm and guileless, and that he was always slightly ashamed of not answering sooner. He had told her about the years of wandering and the various things he had tried and the way none of them had ever felt like they were building toward anything. Until now, she said. They were sitting on the boarding house porch, wrapped in coats in the pale end-of-February sunlight that had no real warmth in it but was earnest in its effort. The street in front of them was quiet. I think so, he said. The land feels different now, like it might actually be mine. It is yours, she said. Legally, he said, but there's owning something and there's belonging somewhere. They are not always the same thing. She looked at him with great attention and then she said, No, they are not. I know that distinction very well. He looked at her. She was looking down at her hands, at the cup of tea she was holding, and there was something in her face that was private and carefully held. Ohio, he said quietly. She nodded. I belonged there once. I thought I would always belong there, And then Calvin died, and everything I thought I knew about where I belonged just rearranged itself. I came out here because I thought maybe belonging somewhere is something you make, not something you find." Gilbert turned that over in his mind. "I believe you might be right," he said. "I am usually right," she said, and the dry humor was back. And he did laugh this time, a short surprised sound that felt rusty but genuine. She looked at him when he laughed, and something in her expression went very soft for just a moment before she looked away. And he catalogued that, filed it away carefully in the part of himself that was paying attention to her in a way that was both new and frighteningly familiar, like a language he had studied long ago and was suddenly remembering. March came in like a verdict. The ground thawed and the dry creek beds ran with snowmelt for 2 weeks and turned the flats around Gilbert's land into something that almost looked like spring, and he began to plant. Corn, mostly, and some winter wheat that was a little late but might come in by fall, and a kitchen garden beside the house where he put in onions and beans and a row of squash. He worked from sunup to sundown because planting season does not negotiate, and his visits to town became less frequent, and he missed them more than he expected to. He saw Ruth at church one Sunday in March. He had not gone to church. He had been riding past on his way to the feed store. The feed store kept Sunday hours, which was either evidence of frontier pragmatism or a theological statement he did not have the energy to examine. And he had paused at the window out of some impulse he could not explain, and Ruth was there, sitting 2 rows from the front, and she was singing. He could not hear it through the glass, but he could see it, the movement of her lips, the slight lift of her chin, and he had the overwhelming sensation of looking at something that was wholly and completely at peace with itself. And the contrast with what lived inside him was so sharp that he almost flinched. He went to the feed store and bought his grain and rode home and planted beans all afternoon in the cold spring wind. And he did not think about the contrast, because he had gotten very good over the years at not thinking about the things that hurt in the quiet, persistent way. He invited her to supper in April. He had thought about it for 2 weeks and then stopped thinking about it and asked her on a Saturday afternoon with the directness of a man who has been hesitating long enough that the hesitation itself is becoming a problem. He said, "I would like to have you to supper at my place, if you would be willing. Next Sunday, perhaps. I can ride in and collect you." Ruth looked at him steadily and said, "Yes, I would like that very much." There was a brief social consideration to navigate. A single woman visiting a man's home alone was the kind of thing small towns notice, but Ruth handled it with the pragmatic calm of a widow who had already decided she would live her life on her own terms, and who treated the opinions of neighbors as something to be respectful of but not beholden to. She mentioned to Mrs. Alderman that she was going out to see Mr. Yates' garden, because she was thinking about what to teach the children about agriculture, which was entirely true and also served to give the visit a wholesome framing. He spent 3 days preparing. He cleaned the house more thoroughly than it had been cleaned in perhaps a decade. He repaired a loose board on the porch. He went through everything he knew how to cook, which was not an extensive list, and settled on a beef stew he had learned to make in Nebraska from a woman named Clara who had run a boarding house and had a philosophy about onions that he had retained long after he had forgotten everything else. He had a pot of the stew on the stove by 10 in the morning, and by the time he rode into town to collect Ruth, the house smelled like something inhabited by someone who was trying. She came out of the boarding house in a dress the color of sage, which he had not seen her wear before, and her dark hair was down in a loose plait, and she was carrying a cloth-wrapped something that she held out to him when she reached the wagon he had borrowed from Alderman. "Cornbread," she said. "I thought I should not arrive empty-handed." The 6-mile ride took half an hour in the wagon, and it was a good half hour, the kind of conversation that moves easily, touching on many things without catching or snagging, the way a stream moves over a bed it knows well. She asked about the planting. He told her about the corn coming in, about the beans, about a particular problem he had with the soil in the northeast corner of the garden plot that he suspected was something to do with drainage. She listened and asked good questions, because she had grown up in Ohio farming country and knew the language of it. When they pulled up to the house, she looked at it for a long moment, the low adobe walls, the new roof, the repaired porch, the kitchen garden coming green in the side yard, and said, "You have made this a real home, Mr. Yates." "I have tried," he said, and felt the truth of it more than he expected to. He helped her down from the wagon and showed her the garden first, because she had asked about it, and she crouched down in the kitchen garden and put her fingers in the soil, and said the kind of things you say about soil when you know soil. And he stood beside her, and felt the specific warm pleasure of someone who cares about a thing you have made caring about it thoughtfully. Inside, the stew was ready and the table was set. He had set it with more attention than he usually gave to such things, with the 2 proper plates he owned, and the tin cups cleaned to the best they could be cleaned, and a wildflower he had found near the creek that morning sitting in a small jar of water in the center of the table, which he had placed there, and then second-guessed, and then left anyway. Ruth looked at the wildflower without comment, but with a warmth in her expression that he noticed. They sat down at the table. He had the ladle in his hand, ready to serve, when Ruth folded her hands on the table and bowed her head. He froze. "Lord," she said in a quiet, unhurried voice, "thank you for this food and for the hands that made it. Thank you for this land that gives it and for the company at this table. Bless this house and the man who keeps it. Amen." She looked up. Gilbert was sitting very still, the ladle still in his hand, the steam from the pot rising between them. He was not sure how much time had passed. It might have been 3 seconds. It might have been considerably more. He was aware of a great and peculiar stillness inside him, not like emptiness. He knew emptiness. He had lived in it for years, but like the stillness of something that has stopped moving because it has arrived somewhere. He could not find words. He had not heard grace said over a table meant for him in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like, and what it felt like was enormous and old and entirely unexpected, and there was something at the back of his throat that was not grief but was in the same general family as grief, the way that a homecoming and a leaving are both things that happen at a doorway. "Are you all right?" Ruth said, gently, without alarm. "Yes," he said. "Then, no, then, I am not sure." She waited. She was extraordinarily good at waiting. "I have not heard grace said in a very long time," he said. He put down the ladle. He looked at the table. "I did not realize, I did not know that it would." He stopped. "Take whatever time you need," Ruth said, simply, without pity or pressure. He sat with it for a moment. The stew steamed. Outside the window, the spring light was long and golden and honest. In the corner of the room, his father's chair sat at its familiar angle, and he looked at it, and thought about his father bowing his head over this same table for 30 years, in this same house, saying words that Gilbert had stopped saying at 18 and had not found again at 31, and the distance between those 2 ages felt, just then, both vast and not quite as permanent as he had thought. "She said thank you for the man who keeps it," he said, not looking at Ruth. "Yes," Ruth said. "No one has thanked God for me since my father was alive," he said. It came out very quietly, and he was a little surprised at himself for saying it, but it was true, and somehow it felt important that it be said out loud. Ruth looked at him across the table. In the last of the afternoon light, her gray eyes were dark and steady, and there was something in them that was not pity and not sentiment, but something truer than both of those things. Something that saw him accurately and did not look away. "Gilbert," she said. It was the first time she had used his name, and the sound of it in her voice was something he filed away with great care. "You are worth thanking God for." He did not have an answer to that. He picked up the ladle and served the stew, and she broke the cornbread and passed him half, and they ate, and the conversation came back gradually and then fully, and by the end of the meal, he had recovered himself enough to be present, to laugh at her story about one of her students, a 7-year-old named Marcus, who had brought a live frog to school hidden in his coat pocket and released it during reading lesson, and to tell her in return about the time his father's mule had gotten into the root cellar and spent a full night down there eating onions and had smelled profoundly terrible for a week afterward. But the grace stayed with him. It stayed in the room after the meal was cleared and after he had ridden her back to town in the dusk and helped her down from the wagon and watched her go inside. It stayed in the house when he rode back to it alone. It stayed with him when he lay down on his cot and looked at the ceiling of his father's house and felt the deep quiet of the Texas night pressing in from all around. He thought about what she had said. The way back is through a door you did not expect. He thought about his father who had kept faith like a fire, not dramatic, not loud, just steady and consistent, fed every day with small, ordinary kindnesses and habitual gratitude. His father had not been a complicated man. Gilbert had always thought in his youth that this was a kind of limitation. Now, lying in the dark at 31, he was not at all sure that was right. He did not pray that night, but he looked at the ceiling and thought about it, and the thinking was different from anything he had done in a long time, not a turning away, but something that was reaching in the dark for a door handle he had not reached for in many years. The suppers became a regular thing. The first Sunday of every month, and then the second Sunday as well. And by June they had stopped counting Sundays and Ruth came out to the land twice a week, and he rode in to see her every Saturday without fail. And the people of Harding Creek noticed and mostly approved, because they were both decent and hardworking, and it seemed to the town that this was a natural and sensible development, which it was, and also a great deal more than merely natural and sensible, which the town may or may not have fully understood. One evening in late May, while Ruth was helping Gilbert plant the second row of the kitchen garden, she had taken to bringing her garden apron when she came, and she had views about the spacing of onion sets that she expressed with conviction. She looked up from the earth and said, "Tell me about before the war, what you were like." He sat back on his heels. The sun was going down behind the western flats and turning everything amber and soft. "Young," he said. "Foolish in the particular way that young men are foolish. I was certain about everything." "Certain about God," she said, not provocatively, just asking. "Absolutely certain," he said. "I walked into church on the Sunday before I enlisted believing entirely that God would take care of the right side, and the right side was obviously us, and I would come home with honor and it would all be just and good." He paused. "I did not know then what just and good actually cost." Ruth pressed a seed into the earth with her thumb. "What did you pray for?" she said. "Before you stopped." He thought about it. "Mostly for the things boys pray for," he said. "Good weather, for our horses to come through. For the man standing next to me to stay upright." He looked at his hands. "For a while I prayed for the war to end. Then I stopped praying for that too, because I could not figure out what kind of God answered that prayer with more of what was happening. The silence between them was the kind that contains more than words could carry. I don't think," Ruth said carefully, "that prayer is about explaining God's logic. I think it's about staying in conversation even when you don't understand. The way you keep talking to someone you love even when they do something that makes no sense to you." Gilbert looked at her. She was pressing another seed into the earth, not looking up, but her voice was the most serious he had heard it. "You keep talking," he said slowly. "You keep talking," she said. "Because the relationship is more important than the argument." He sat with that for a long while as the sun finished its descent, and the first evening stars appeared over the flat eastern horizon. He did not say anything for so long that Ruth looked up to check whether he had heard her. "I heard you," he said. She nodded and went back to the planting, and they finished the row in a comfortable, loaded silence that was not uncomfortable at all. He tried it the next morning. Very early, before the sun was up, standing at the back of the house in the cold dawn with his coffee, looking east at the dark line where land became sky. He stood there for a while and then he said, quietly and without much formal structure, "I don't know if you are still listening. I don't know what I am doing. I have been gone a long time." He stopped. He looked at the horizon. I think I may be finding my way back. I'm not sure. I thought you should know. The horizon lightened from black to gray to pale gold, and the first birds began their noise in the cedar line, and nothing answered him except the morning, which was its own kind of answer. He told Ruth about it on Saturday. He was not sure why he told her, except that the impulse was very clear, and he had learned to pay attention to the impulses that surprised him. She listened without interjecting. When he was finished, she said, "How did it feel?" "Awkward," he said, "like speaking a language I had forgotten." "That is exactly what it is like," she said, "and the awkwardness goes away." "You sound certain of that," he said. "I am," she said, "because I lost it once too. After Calvin died, for almost a year I could not pray at all. And then I started again very badly, very awkwardly, saying things that made no particular sense, and it came back. Not the same as before. Different. Better, I think. More honest." He looked at her. This was more than she usually said about her grief, and he knew it, and he received it with the care it deserved. "I am glad you found your way back," he said. "I am glad you are finding yours," she said. And the look she gave him with those words was one he would think about for a long time after, direct and warm and with a particular quality of seeing, as if she was looking at the specific person he was and finding that person to be, somehow, enough. June on the Texas flats was hot and sudden, and the corn came up strong, and the beans were doing well, and Gilbert found himself, for the first time in a very long time, calculating forward, thinking about the fall harvest, about what he would plant next year, about whether the second room needed a proper bed or just the cot. These were the thoughts of a man who expected to be somewhere, and he noticed them the way you notice the symptoms of a recovery you had stopped expecting. He kissed Ruth Winslow for the first time in the middle of June, on the porch of his house, in the early evening, after she had said something funny about Marcus the frog boy, who had progressed from frogs to a full garter snake that had surprised two of the older girls so thoroughly that one had climbed onto her desk and refused to come down for 20 minutes. He had laughed, a real laugh, the kind that comes from the center of you, and Ruth was laughing too, and they were standing close because the porch was small, and he looked at her laughing, and the feeling in his chest was so large and clear that he stopped processing it analytically and just moved toward it. He took her face in his hands very gently, the way you hold something you are afraid of dropping, and she stopped laughing and looked at him with a steadiness that meant she had known this moment was coming and had been waiting for it without rush. He kissed her once briefly and then pulled back to look at her. "Ruth," he said. "Gilbert," she said. "I love you," he said. He had not planned to say it that fast, but there it was, already said, hanging in the warm June air between them, true and irreversible. I know that is probably faster than is proper, but I have been watching propriety slow me down for 30 years, and I thought I would just say the thing. Her face did something complicated and wonderful that ended in a smile that was brighter than anything on that flat, sunlit land. "Good," she said, "because I love you too. I have for some time." "How long?" He said. She considered. "Since February, I think, when you said that owning something and belonging somewhere are not always the same thing." He kissed her again, less briefly, and she put her hand against his chest, and the evening air was warm, and the corn was tall in the field, and the two dry creek beds, Little Heron and Cutwater, were running in summer mode, thin and silver in the last of the light, and Gilbert Yates felt, with a certainty that was entirely different from the brittle certainty of his 18-year-old self. This certainty had been tested and was still standing, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He asked her to marry him in July. He did it properly, on a Saturday evening, sitting on the porch with the summer stars beginning to show above the flats. He had been planning words for a week and at the moment discarded all of them and said simply, "Ruth, I would like for you to be my wife. I would like to make this home yours too. I would like to wake up every morning in this house and know that you are in it." Ruth was quiet for a moment, a long moment, long enough that he felt the air leave his lungs in a slow, careful way. "You have thought about this seriously," she said, not a question. "I have thought about it since February," he said. When you said that belonging somewhere is something you make, she laughed softly, you were listening. I always listened to you, he said, every word. She looked at the stars for a moment. Then she looked at him. Yes, she said. Gilbert Yates, I will marry you. The relief and joy that went through him were so complete that he had to stop himself from making some noise that would have been undignified. He took her hand instead and held it, and they sat on the porch for a long time in the July dark, making plans and being quiet and making plans again, and the night was full of insects and stars and the distant sound of the creek. They were married in September, in the church without a bell, by the reverend who had arrived in Harding Creek in the spring, and who had a magnificent gray beard, and a low rumbling voice that seemed designed specifically for officiating at weddings. The whole town came. Tom Alderman cried. Mrs. Alderman pretended she was not crying. Old Mr. Plimmer, who had held boards during the schoolhouse construction, sat in the front pew and nodded with great satisfaction throughout the ceremony as if he had been instrumental in bringing this about, which, in the way that small-town communities are always instrumentally responsible for things that happen within them, perhaps he had been. Gilbert stood at the front of the church in the best coat he owned, which he had bought in Dodge City and which fit him well enough, and watched Ruth come down the aisle in a dress that was not white but the color of winter wheat, and she was holding a small bunch of late summer wildflowers, purple and yellow and pale gold, and she was looking straight at him, and her eyes were bright and clear and completely without fear. He thought, standing there waiting for her, I am 31 years old and I have spent the last 8 years looking for the door back in, and she was the door. When they said their vows, he said them clearly, in a steady voice, looking directly at her, because he had thought about these words, not the formal words which he repeated faithfully, but the ones underneath them for weeks, and he meant every syllable. When the Reverend said they could kiss, there was applause from the pews, and someone, he suspected Tom Alderman, let out a whoop that was entirely inappropriate to the dignity of the occasion, and completely in keeping with the spirit of it. They went back to the land together, his land now theirs. Ruth had packed her trunk, the same trunk she had arrived with on the November stage, 11 months ago, and Gilbert helped her carry it into the house, both of them holding a handle this time, which he thought was the right image for the whole endeavor. She put her things in the second room, which now had a proper bed. She hung a small cross on the wall above it, a simple wooden one she had carried from Ohio. She put her books on the shelves he had built, and her books fit the shelves as if the shelves had always been waiting for them. That evening she made supper something better than his stew, a chicken and vegetable dish she had learned from her mother, and she set the table and they sat down together, and she folded her hands and he did the same, which was new but felt natural in a way that surprised him, and she said grace. He bowed his head as she spoke, and this time he was not struck speechless. He sat in it. He let it settle over him like warm water. He let himself be included in it, the thanks for the food and the land and the company, the blessing on the house. He was in the prayer this time, not just beside it, and the difference between those two positions was everything. When she said amen, he said amen too, and the word was small and simple and very old, and it fit in his mouth the way something fits when it has been shaped for you specifically. She looked at him across the table with a quiet radiance. "Welcome back," she said softly. He looked at her, and at the room around them, and at the window where the evening light was painting the Texas flats in the colors of a world that had been rebuilt from something broken and made stronger for the rebuilding. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on the door." "I never give up on doors," she said. "I am a school teacher. We believe in the fundamental educability of all people." He laughed deep and warm, and she laughed with him, and the house held it the way a good house holds everything steadily, without fuss. Autumn came and the corn came in strong. Gilbert harvested for 2 weeks straight, from before dawn to after dark, and Ruth helped in the evenings and in the mornings and generally treated the harvest as a shared endeavor in a way that told him she had not just married the man but the whole life, the land and the work and the seasons, and he was moved by it more than he knew how to say. So he said it simply. "I did not know it would be like this." "Like what?" she said, cutting the dried stalks with a long blade. "Good," he said. "I did not know it would actually be good." She paused and looked at him. "Did you think it would be bad?" "I did not know what to think," he said honestly. "I had been operating on very low expectations for a long time." Ruth set the blade aside and walked over to him and took his face in both her hands in the field, with stalks of corn all around and the autumn sky broad and blue above them, and she looked at him with those gray eyes that had always seen him clearly. "Gilbert Yates," she said, "we are going to have a very good life." He put his hands over hers. "I believe you," he said. "I believe you completely." They wrote to his sister Margaret in Tennessee in October. Gilbert had been composing the letter in his head since July and finally sat down and wrote it properly, telling Margaret about Ruth, about the land, about the house, about the wedding, about all of it in a letter that was longer than any he had written since before the war. Ruth added a paragraph at the end in her neat schoolteacher's handwriting, introducing herself and saying she hoped to meet Margaret someday, and that she had heard about her from Gilbert and already felt that she knew her. Margaret's answer came in 6 weeks, which was fast, and it was 3 pages long and warm beyond measure, and ended with the declaration that she had prayed for Gilbert every single day since 1865, and she was going to write a very long letter to God about this development. Gilbert read that line twice and then showed it to Ruth and said nothing, and Ruth put her hand on his arm and said nothing either, and between the two of them the nothing was full and complete. In the spring of 1874, the school had grown to 16 children, and Ruth was managing the expansion with the efficient grace of someone who had been preparing for this their whole life. She had submitted a request for a second chalkboard and a set of readers to the county, which had begun, cautiously, to acknowledge that Harding Creek was a community worth maintaining, and she had organized a small lending library from donated books that lived on a shelf in the corner of the schoolhouse, and was used with great enthusiasm by the children and somewhat more cautious enthusiasm by their parents. Gilbert had expanded the farm. He had bought 2 cows and added to the cornfield and was considering whether chickens were a practical addition to the operation, a question he and Ruth debated with more earnestness than it probably deserved, because they both enjoyed the debate. "Chickens are practical," Ruth said one April evening. "Eggs meet the social cohesion of having small living things about." "Chickens are trouble," Gilbert said. "They get into everything and they are incapable of solving their own problems." "That describes most living things," Ruth said. "It describes my corn," he agreed. He bought 6 chickens in May. They were a great deal of trouble and also excellent, and Ruth named all of them after women she had admired in her reading life, which meant that he spent the summer of 1874 chasing a hen named Elizabeth after Elizabeth Blackwell through the corn rows every time someone left the gate open. That summer Ruth told him she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning after breakfast, with the easy calm of someone delivering news they have been sitting with for a while and have already made their peace with. She said, "Gilbert, we are going to have a baby. In the winter, I think. February, perhaps." He was standing at the sink and he turned around and looked at her, and for the second time in his life at her table he found himself unable to find words. But this time the speechlessness was a different color entirely. It was not the ghost gray of grief returning, but the gold and white of something so entirely good that language was simply insufficient to it. He crossed the room in 2 steps and gathered her in and held her, and she held him back, and they stood in the kitchen of his father's house, their house now properly, fully, with the morning light coming through the window and the chickens making their impractical noise outside, and he said finally into her hair, "Ruth." "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said. "Thank God," she said, and she meant it exactly as she said it. He looked up at the ceiling and then out the window at the sky and said, without any awkwardness at all now, "Thank you," and meant it exactly as he said it. The summer was full and warm and good. Gilbert worked the farm and Ruth taught school until October, when she agreed to rest more and let two of the older students take over the morning readings under her direction, which was also an education for them in the art of instruction. She spent the fall afternoons in the house, mending and reading and planning the spring curriculum, and Gilbert was aware. Every time he came in from the fields and found her there in the chair by the window, not his father's chair, which still sat in its corner like a monument, but a new chair they had bought together in August, aware, with a precision that never dulled, of how different this was from what the house had been when he arrived. He had arrived to dust and silence and a table missing a leg. He lived now in a house that had chickens and a kitchen garden and lesson plans on the table, and a woman who said grace and a child on the way, and a set of books whose names he had begun to learn, and a faith that was coming back in the particular form it takes when it has been rebuilt after being broken. Not the easy certainty of youth, but something harder one and more durable. He prayed every morning now, not long prayers. Simple ones, the way his father had prayed, the way Ruth prayed, direct and unhurried, as if speaking to someone who was present and paying attention. He did not ask for much. He gave thanks for the land and the work and for Ruth, specifically and by name, every morning, because she had walked through the door of his life at exactly the right moment, and she deserved to be specifically named. Winter came, and the baby came with it, in the early hours of a February morning, while the wind was running hard across the flats and the cedar line was bending west. The doctor rode out from Harding Creek through the dark, arriving just in time to be helpful in the way that good doctors are helpful, competently, without drama. Mrs. Alderman came too, because Ruth had asked her, and she turned out to be the steadiest person in the room, which surprised no one who knew Mrs. Alderman. The baby was a boy. He came into the world at 4 in the morning with the particular determination of a person who has a great deal to do and has decided to begin immediately, and he was red and furious and entirely healthy, and Gilbert held him in the gray dawn light of February while Ruth rested, and the wind outside gradually quieted, and looked at this small person who was his son. The weight of it was something he had not anticipated. Not the physical weight, which was considerable for something so new, but the weight of it in meaning, the weight of a future contained in a present moment, the weight of continuity, the sense of a thread running back through his father and forward through this child, unbroken despite everything. He held the baby and said very quietly, "Hello, I am your father. We are going to do the best we can." Ruth, from the bed, said in a tired and entirely loving voice, "That is a reasonable opening statement." They named the boy Thomas, after Gilbert's father, which was Ruth's suggestion, made in the first week of her pregnancy, and which had produced in Gilbert a gratitude so complete it had been difficult to thank her adequately for it. Thomas Yates grew in the house on the flat Texas land the way strong things grow in honest soil. He was a large and cheerful baby who regarded everything in his environment with a scientific interest that his mother found delightful and his father found entirely familiar, because the boy had Ruth's gray eyes and Ruth's directness, and also, possibly, Ruth's tendency to be usually right. The town of Harding Creek entered 1875 with some notable changes. A second preacher arrived to assist at the church, a young man fresh from seminary who was idealistic and full of energy, and who drove Gilbert slightly mad with his eagerness, but whom Ruth found charming, and who was, whatever else, good with the children. The county finally delivered the second chalkboard and the readers to the schoolhouse, which Ruth accepted with grace and immediately put to work. The Delaney cattle outfit, which had been expanding for 2 years, drove a large herd north in the spring, and the sound of 300 cattle moving across the flats was something Thomas, strapped to his mother's back while she tended the garden, found entirely riveting. Tom Alderman's general store acquired a new partner, his nephew from San Antonio, who was sharp and cheerful, and who introduced the concept of a small selection of books for sale, which pleased Ruth enormously, and which Gilbert affected to be indifferent to, but who was caught one evening sitting at the kitchen table reading a novel he had bought. which was a volume of adventures set in the far West and which he defended to Ruth on the grounds that it was important to know what people thought the West was like. "It is nothing like this," Ruth said, reading over his shoulder. "No," he agreed. "This is much better." She kissed the top of his head and went to check on Thomas. The injustices of the frontier were not invisible from that flat piece of Texas land. Gilbert knew, and Ruth knew, that the ground beneath their feet had been taken from people who had lived on it long before. The Comanche, the Kiowa, they had been pushed and pushed and pushed again, onto lands that were smaller every year, by a machinery of law and military force that did not ask their permission, and did not compensate them fairly and did not, for the most part, concern itself with whether what was being done was right. Gilbert had ridden through country in the years after the war where the evidence of this was written plainly in empty spaces and burning villages and faces of men and women who had been dispossessed of everything they knew. It sat in him as a piece of knowledge that he could not undo and could not unknow, a weight alongside all the other weights he carried. He had spoken to Ruth about it, one evening in the spring of 1875, as plainly as he could. She had listened without looking away. "I know," she said. "I think about it too. I think about it when I look at this land and feel glad to be here, because the gladness and the sorrow are the same land." She paused. "I don't know what the right response is except to be honest about it, to not pretend it didn't happen, to teach the children accurately even when the truth is complicated." He looked at her. "You will teach it accurately," he said. It was not a question. "Always," she said. "History belongs to the truth, not to the comfortable version." This was one of the things he loved most fiercely about her. She did not flinch from complicated things. She held them honestly and kept going. The year turned into 1876, and Thomas learned to walk, which he did with great velocity and no apparent concern for obstacles, requiring constant intervention from both his parents, who developed excellent reflexes and a unified vocabulary for communicating rapid warnings across short distances. He said his first clear word in March, which was birds, pointing at the chickens with absolute conviction, which led to a family discussion about the taxonomic status of chickens that Ruth found hilarious and Gilbert conducted with complete seriousness. Margaret came to visit in the summer of 1876. She came from Tennessee by rail to Amarillo and then by stage to Harding Creek, and she arrived in much the same way Ruth had arrived on the afternoon stage, with a trunk, looking at the town with an expression that was harder to read. Gilbert was there to meet her, and when she stepped down from the coach she looked at him for a long moment and then put her arms around him and held on for a good while, and he held on back. And when she finally let go, she was crying and trying to be composed about it, and he was not crying, but it was a nearer thing than he would have admitted. Ruth was at the house. She had prepared supper, something ambitious that smelled good from the road, and she was at the door when the wagon pulled up, and Margaret took one look at her and said, in the practical Tennessee drawl she had never lost, "Well, I can see exactly why my brother was in such a state." Ruth laughed. Margaret laughed. Gilbert helped with the trunk. Margaret stayed for 3 weeks. She and Ruth became the kind of friends that certain women become very quickly, with an ease and depth of understanding that leaves the men in their vicinity feeling pleasantly peripheral. They talked for hours. Margaret played with Thomas and declared him to be the finest child in the state of Texas, which was an opinion she stated frequently and at volume. She came to church on Sunday and sat beside Gilbert and did not say anything when he sang. He had started singing again, haltingly, in the months since Thomas was born, the old hymns coming back like old roads remembered, but she gripped his arm once briefly, in a way that said everything. On her last evening she sat with Gilbert on the porch after Ruth had gone in to put Thomas down, and the summer night was warm and full of stars. "You are happy," she said, as if verifying something. "Yes," he said. "I was not sure I would ever say that about you," she said. She was not being cruel, she was being honest the way sisters are honest. "I was not sure either," he said. "She is remarkable," Margaret said. "She is," he agreed. "And the faith," Margaret said carefully. "Is that are you?" "Yes," he said. "I am back. It is different than before. Better." Ruth said something once that I have thought about ever since. She said that staying in conversation with God is like staying in conversation with someone you love even when you don't understand them. That the relationship is more important than the argument. He paused. I stopped arguing eventually. And then I realized the relationship had been there the whole time, waiting. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Father would have been so glad." Gilbert looked at his father's land, at the corn standing tall in the dark, at the low line of the cedar posts along the east edge, at the pale thread of Little Heron Creek in the distance, and thought about Thomas Yates, Sr. His patience, his quietness, his steady daily faith, the shape worn into the seat of his chair. "I know," he said. "I am sorry I did not come back while he was here." "He knew you would find your way," Margaret said. "He told me so. He said, Gilbert is the kind of person who takes the long road but gets there." Gilbert looked at the stars for a long time. "He was right," he said. "He usually was." Ruth came out then, settling into her chair beside him, and Margaret took the third chair on the other side, and the three of them sat together in the Texas summer night while somewhere in the house a 2-year-old slept with his fists curled under his cheeks, and the world felt just then exactly as large and exactly as full as it was. Margaret went back to Tennessee and wrote a letter the week she arrived that was 6 pages long, and told Ruth everything about their mother and their childhood, and the family history that Margaret felt Ruth deserved to know, which Ruth received and read with great attention, and then kept in a box with her other important papers. The years that followed were not without difficulty. The winter of 1877 was the hardest in memory, with cold that cracked the earth and froze the creek solid for 6 weeks, and killed a third of the corn Gilbert had stored in the crib before he could move it to the house. They were careful with money that year, and Ruth taught extra days to supplement their income, and they got through it the way people get through hard winters on the frontier, steadily, with practical adjustments and no catastrophizing. There was a man in town, in the winter of 1877, a drover named Cullen who had stayed on after the Delaney drive, and who had decided, for reasons that were never entirely clear, that Ruth was the person he wanted to force his attention upon. He made a nuisance of himself twice at the school, and once outside the general store in a way that was unpleasant enough to warrant a firm response. Gilbert had the conversation with Cullen that such a situation called for. He was very calm about it, and very direct, and the specific quality of his calm seemed to communicate itself adequately, because Cullen left Harding Creek 2 days later and was not seen again. Ruth had been entirely capable of handling Cullen herself, and had told Cullen so, in terms that were crisp and unambiguous. Gilbert's conversation with the man was not about her inability to protect herself. It was about his own willingness to stand between her and anything that meant her harm, which was a different thing entirely. Ruth understood this distinction and thanked him for it without making him feel heroic about it, which was exactly right. In the spring of 1878, Ruth told him she was expecting again. "February again," he said. "November this time," she said, and there was a brightness in her face that matched his own. Their second child was a girl, born on a clear November evening with considerably less drama than Thomas's February arrival, as if she had noted how the first one was done and had decided to be more efficient about it. They named her Clara, after the boarding house woman in Nebraska who had taught Gilbert to make stew, which made Ruth laugh when he explained it, and then agree that it was a fine name. Clara was smaller than Thomas had been and quieter, and she regarded the world with an observational patience that suggested she was collecting information before rendering any judgments. Thomas, at nearly 4, was fascinated by her in the way of a person who has been the center of attention, and has suddenly been presented with a rival he is not entirely sure is a threat or an ally. Ruth handled this with characteristic skill, finding ways to make Thomas feel essential to Clara's well-being, a strategy that worked brilliantly and resulted in Thomas becoming, over the next several years, the most attentive older brother in the county. Gilbert watched his children grow and felt, consistently, the kind of wonder that does not diminish with familiarity. He had not expected this. He had not expected to be someone who could look at his children eating breakfast and feel a joy so clean and solid it was like a foundation stone. But here it was, morning after morning, real and persistent. He said grace now. Had been saying it for 2 years, not every meal but many, and always on Sundays, and always when it felt right, which was often. He did not say it the way his father had, with the practiced brevity of long habit, or the way Ruth said it, with the flowing natural eloquence of someone who had never stopped. He said it in his own way, which was direct and plain and sometimes longer than he expected, because there was more to be grateful for than he usually managed to say in his head. Thomas, at the age of 5, had begun to participate. He would bow his head with great solemnity and say his own amen at the end with the conviction of a person who fully understands the weight of the word, and Gilbert and Ruth exchanged glances across the table that were full of the particular delight of parents watching a child choose something good of their own accord. The church got its bell in 1879. The whole town turned out for the installation, and when it rang for the first time, a clear, carrying sound that went out across the flat land and was probably audible for 2 miles. Gilbert stood in the churchyard with Thomas on his shoulders and Clara in Ruth's arms, and felt the sound move through him in a way that was not merely physical. He went to church most Sundays now, had been going for over a year. He sat in the pew with Ruth beside him and felt the accumulated ordinariness of it, the standing and sitting and singing and listening, as a kind of anchor. Not the anchor of someone held down, but the anchor of someone with a fixed point to return to. By 1880, Harding Creek was a real town. There was a bank small but legitimate, and a new hotel that did not lean, and a doctor's office with a proper sign, and a post office that was open 6 days a week, and the church with its bell, and Ruth's school, which now had 23 students and had been formally chartered by the county, which meant funding and a small salary increase that Ruth celebrated with the purchase of an extravagant number of new readers. Thomas had started school that fall in his mother's classroom, which they had discussed carefully beforehand to ensure everyone understood the rules. At home he was Thomas' son, and his mother was Ruth or Mama. At school he was Thomas Yates, student, and she was Mrs. Yates. He adhered to this with a seriousness that was deeply endearing, and on his first day he had walked in, taken his seat, and addressed her as Mrs. Yates, ma'am, with the gravity of a senator, which had caused 2 of the older students to hide their laughter in their sleeves, and which Ruth had received with perfect composure. Gilbert had been present, outside the window, for approximately the first 30 seconds of this, and had ridden home in a state of happiness that was almost embarrassing. Clara, at 2, was developing the vocabulary and the opinions of someone considerably older, and had recently expanded her repertoire to include lengthy monologues addressed to the chickens, none of whom were named Elizabeth any longer because that particular hen had retired from public life in 1877, and the others had been replaced with a generation Ruth had elected to name after geographical features: Ohio, Tennessee, and 3 others who were simply called the Kansas Sisters, collectively, which Clara had adopted as a single name and used accordingly. November of 1880 brought the news that the rail line might be extended through Harding Creek, which was the kind of rumor that swept frontier towns with regularity and turned out to be true about half the time. Gilbert listened to the speculation at the general store without getting too far ahead of himself, but he noted that if the rail did come through, the value of the land would change considerably, and the isolation that had characterized their life, comfortable as it had been, would also change, and the Texas Panhandle would be less a backwater and more a way through. He talked to Ruth about it that evening. They were at the table after supper with Thomas in bed and Clara asleep in her crib and the lamp burning steady between them, and the conversation had the quality of all their best conversations, exploratory, honest, equally weighted. "If the rail comes," she said, "more families will come, the school will grow again. The land values will rise," he said. "We could sell a portion if we needed to." "We won't need to," she said with calm certainty. He smiled. "No, no," she said. "We are doing well, Gilbert. We are doing genuinely well." He looked at her across the lamp. At 31 she had been a woman arriving somewhere unknown with a trunk and a plan. At 34 she was this settled and sure and luminous in an ordinary lamplight way that was more beautiful to him than anything he had seen in those years of wandering. Her dark hair was pinned up, and there was a small smudge of chalk on her wrist that she had not noticed, from a long day of writing letters for children who were learning the alphabet of the world. "Yes," he said, "we are." He reached across the table and took her hand. She turned it and held his. Outside, the November wind moved through the cedar line, and Little Heron Creek ran thin and silver in the dark, and the two dry creek beds of his father's land carried the water of another year toward whatever lay downstream. He had come home in October of 1873 to a house of dust and silence. He had come home a man who had not prayed in 12 years, who had not belonged anywhere in 8, who had built things and worked hard and traveled far, and had still not found the thing that made it mean something. The meaning had come to supper. It had sat across the table and bowed its head and said grace, and he had found himself unable to speak afterward, and that silence had been the beginning of the long way back. He had learned in the years since that the way back is not always dramatic. It does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives on a stage from Amarillo with a brown traveling hat and a trunk it is dragging single-handedly across a dusty street, and it asks for nothing except a hand with the other end. The morning after their November conversation, Gilbert rose before Ruth and made coffee and stood at the back of the house in the pre-dawn dark, the cup warm between his hands, and he looked east at the dark horizon that was just beginning to suggest itself in the faintest possible gray. He said, as he said every morning now, what he was grateful for: the land, the work, the season, his son who would ask 4 questions before breakfast every morning and one of them would always be impossible to answer, his daughter who talked to chickens with philosophical seriousness, and who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness in equal measure, his sister in Tennessee who wrote letters and prayed for him every day and had never stopped, and Ruth Winslow Yates, who had arrived in November and changed everything, who had said grace at his table when grace had not been said there in years, who had spoken of God not as an argument to be won, but as a relationship to be kept, who had loved him when he was still finding his way back, and had not required him to arrive before she extended that love, and who had, in her completely unheroic and practical and deeply kind way, been the door he had not expected. The horizon lightened. Gold came up behind the flat edge of the world, washing the sky from gray to rose to the clear pale blue of a Texas winter morning. The chickens began their noise. Somewhere inside the house, a small voice said something that was probably addressed to Clara, which meant Thomas was awake and conducting his morning operations. Gilbert drank his coffee and looked at the sky and said, "Last of all, thank you. Not for anything complicated. Not for resolved theology or settled doctrine or perfect understanding. For the morning, for the land, for the open door and the woman who had stood in it and the life that had been made on the other side." Then he went inside, where his family was waking up, where the stove needed to be stoked and the coffee needed to be shared and the day needed to begin, and he went in with the full and ordinary intention of being present for all of it, every unremarkable, irreplaceable, grace-filled moment of it. Ruth was in the kitchen when he came in, her hair still loose, Clara balanced on her hip, watching the stove with the expression of someone who is calculating the optimal moment to add more wood. She looked up when he came in and gave him the particular smile she gave him in the mornings, which was different from every other smile because it was unguarded and immediate and said only, "You are here." Good. Thomas came in behind him at speed, sliding in his socks on the swept floor, asking his first question of the day before he had fully stopped moving, which was something about why the sky was pink this morning and was it different pink than yesterday and could you measure pink? Gilbert caught him as he slid past and set him upright and looked at his son's bright, questioning face and thought, This is what it builds toward. "Good morning," he said to all of them. "Good morning," Ruth said and put the kettle on. The morning light came through the window and fell across the table where grace was said and stew was served, and plans were made and arguments were conducted with love and children were fed and letters were written, and two people who had both come to the end of their known roads had found, against all expectation, that the road continued and was worth the walking. Thomas asked 4 questions before breakfast, as usual. One of them was, in fact, impossible to answer. Gilbert tried anyway, because that was what fathers did, and Ruth listened and supplied better answers where she could, and Clara threw a piece of cornbread on the floor and commented on it in her own language, and the chickens were loud outside, and the November sun climbed over the flat Texas horizon and stretched its light across the land of Little Heron and Cutwater creeks, and everything was exactly, finally, completely as it should be.